So we have a vision here at First Press that we've been talking about, and the vision we have called Love Your Neighbor, or Love Your Neighbor Initiative. How do we make that vision happen? Because it's one thing to have a vision, it's another thing to actually make it happen. One of the most iconic visions in our modern era came from Martin Luther King Jr. when he made his I Have a Dream speech. But he didn't just make that speech, did he? He made the speech, and then he went out and walked the streets to make it happen. All across America, they walked the streets to make I Have a Dream happen. So the question we have is, how do we make Love Your Neighbor happen? I want to give you an image. One hot summer, I had a friend whose dad owned a drag racing car. And he had that drag racing car in this huge garage that he had. Like, for a 14-year-old kid, there was nothing cooler than somebody's dad who owned a drag racing car. I mean, it was kind of hilarious, the sport. I didn't really understand the strategy of it, but it just seemed to me that you put it on the track and you put the pedal down and you just go. I don't know what the strategy of drag racing is, but I tell you, it was the coolest thing. And in this huge garage, he had this pit crew of men that took care of the car. And they all had their areas of expertise. So one guy was the fuel guy, one guy was the guy that lined the car up to the starting line, one guy did the tires, and then there was the guy who, I'm assuming, drew the short straw and had to actually get behind the wheel of this thing. And we had so much fun watching them work on this drag racing car in their garage. Here's what was weird. I never saw that car get on the track. It was like 2 years I remember going by, and they'd be working, and I never saw the rubber actually hit the road. I mean, what's the point of having a car if you never put it on the track? And we, as a church, are similar. We've got people who have built this body. We've got people who have all kinds of different expertise, who are a part of this church, who do all kinds of different things. And now we have this vision for this body, and we're full of gas, and we're just ready to go. But what good does it do if at some point the rubber doesn't hit the road? Like, what good is it to have a vision if you can't figure out how to make the vision real? And so we've got this Love Your Neighbor vision, and we're excited about it, and now we're working toward ways to make it real. Look, in terms of what's our vision, the answer to what's our vision isn't necessarily what I might think is a good vision or what you might. The answer to what's our vision has to be consistent with the vision that Jesus had. And in the Bible, the most basic vision that formed all of Jesus' other visions is made really clear. Like in the Bible, it's spelt out so clearly. Jesus returned to his hometown in Nazareth. Now, he's just beginning his ministry. He had a baptism with John, and then he went into the desert, if you know that story, and he was tempted by a voice that was trying to tempt him not to answer that call and that vision. But he decided he was going to do it. And then he went to Nazareth, his hometown. And he went into the synagogue, and everybody knew who he was and recognized him. And he opened the scroll, and he read from the scroll. And this is what he said. I come to bring sight to the blind, to give good news to the poor, and to free those who are oppressed. Now, everybody knew what those words were. Those words were from Isaiah. People had been brought up on those words. Jesus was reading a vision that had been given to the people of God 1,000 years before. Abraham was given the same vision. When God said to Abraham, I want you to go be a blessing to the world. I'm going to bless you, but the whole reason I'm blessing you is that you can go out and be a blessing to the world. So every vision that we have as Christian people have to somehow be a child of or an expression of this first and original vision. I come to bring sight to the blind, to give good news to the poor, to free those who are oppressed. Now here's the trap. Here's the trap. Oftentimes we come to a church because we need personal help. Or oftentimes we'll come to a church and our goal is personal salvation. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with wanting an intimate relationship with God, just me and just God. Well, Jesus modeled that. But it's noteworthy and it's interesting that that was not the original vision. The original vision that the people of God had was to go out into the world and help people. And the most beautiful child born of that vision is love your neighbor. See, when Jesus taught love your neighbor, it came out of that Isaiah teaching. So how do we make it happen? How do we make it real? How do we move from talking about it or hearing about it to actually doing it? Now, to extend my drag racing car analogy, there is some risk involved in drag racing. Like if you're actually going to put that car onto the track, if you're going to lay the rubber on the road, there's a lot of risk involved. Whoever's behind that wheel is going to be doing a whole lot of shaking and a whole lot of vibrating. You have to be willing to take the risk to put the rubber on the road. What's the risk that we take as a church? To love your enemy, you become vulnerable. You risk your safety. For us as Christians, to put the rubber on the road means to take some risks. And it means to trust that the body that we're riding in is going to make it to the finish line. And so, listen to these words from Paul. This is what Ian just read. These words are so impactful. Paul says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say, rejoice." And we're like, Paul, do you have any idea what we're going through? Like our lives are just really hard. And then we remember that Paul went through all kinds of things that were just as hard as the things we're going through. Paul had a really hard life, but he still says rejoice. And then he says this, the Lord is near. So don't be anxious about anything. Don't be anxious about anything, Paul. Paul, don't you know? Yeah, I do know what you're going through. If you know anything about Paul, I know. Now, what Paul is going to say next are words that we need to find a way to put deep into the places of our faith and deep into the places of our hearts, because these words are just so important. Here's what Paul says. But in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. There is a power at work that is way beyond anything that we could ever do. Paul says it transcends all understanding. So Paul says, present your requests to God. And if your request is in line with this original vision to free the oppressed, to preach good news to the poor, more specifically for us these past weeks, to love your neighbor, if your request is in line with that original vision, God will help you in it. God will show you the way. God will give you everything you need to reach that vision. And if we can first believe it, but then actually experience it in our church and in our community, it's just transforming. So I want to ask you this. What visions has God planted in your heart? It could be a vision to sell your house and downsize, and then you'd have a lot of extra resource to use for yourself, but also maybe to share with other people. Kimberly and I have talked about that. We've talked about, what if we sell our house in Ottawa and buy a trailer somewhere? And then we'd have all kinds of extra resource for ourselves, but also to share with others. Kimberly's not quite convinced on the trailer part yet. We're still talking about that. Or maybe your vision is to raise your young people in a way that is not all about ladder climbing, making the most money, career success. Maybe your vision is to find a way to raise your young people so they're more in line with the original vision of love your neighbor. Like, that's how they see their lives. Like, they're instruments for love your neighbor. Maybe that's your vision for your children. I'll share a vision that I had. When I was a kid, I loved music. As I got older, I was fortunate enough to make a living in music for about 10 years or so after my undergrad. I just did a club circuit. The people that I played for were people that had no idea about any of the teachings of the Bible or of the church. Like, I was raised in that and I knew about it, but there was like this whole other world that just had no idea. But they were such good people that I got to know. They were just like me. They had the same hopes and the same dreams as I did. And every now and again, in some dark and smoky and dank bar, I'd play gospel songs. I'd play a Chris Christopherson song like Why Me Lord, or Knocking on Heaven's Doors. And they just loved it. And I grew to realize that all people are spiritual. But they just had no connection with any of that I grew up with. And as the years went by, my vision formed that sought to find a way to connect this world with that world. And I wanted to be a part of a church that found a way to connect that world with this world. And that was a vision that I had years ago, and I'm still living it out. So I ask you, what vision do you have for your life? And Paul just says, if your vision is in line with the original vision of love your neighbor, don't be anxious about it. God promises to help you and throughout give you a peace that surpasses understanding. God promises that there is a higher power that will be there with you to help you achieve it. It's a promise. Maybe your vision is to take care of the environment. Is taking care of the environment in line with God's will? Of course it is. So don't be afraid of moving toward that vision, because God will be there. Don't be anxious. Paul says God is near. We have a vision for the Beach Street property. We've just been talking about it. We'd love to just have a community garden on that property. And whatever we grow can go out and help all the people around us. That's just a vision we have. Is it in line with God's will? I would think so. We want to have some park space there, some benches, some paths. Make it nice. Make it a prayer garden. What's your vision? Just ask yourself, if you're anxious about a vision that you have, Paul's saying don't be anxious. Just make sure it's in line with love your neighbor. And if it is, you have a power. It's going to be there with you, and it will help you with it. Wouldn't it be amazing if we as a church, didn't have any fear when it came to going forward with a vision that we know is in line with God's will? Like, what would we be capable of doing, you and I, and we? Because God has blessed us with so much resource here and so much expertise. What would it be like to take Paul's teaching to heart that says, don't be anxious. God is near. It's a big question that we need to address, how to make this vision real. And you all have visions in your heart. I know you do. We work hard here at First Press to make visions real, which is a good thing. Have for years. It's a good thing because there will be a day when we'll be standing before God. There'll be a day when you'll be standing before God and when I'll be standing before God. That image of standing before God should not be a frightening one. Because even if we fail, which we will to some extent, even if we fail to really love your neighbor the way Jesus wants us to, God's love will override almost anything on that day. And on that day when you stand before God and when I stand before God, God's going to say to you, and I paraphrase, man, you were part of a team. You were part of a team that put together this car. That car had like thousands of horses under the hood. Like, I was really impressed by what you put together. And we'll say, thank you, I was happy to be a part of the team. And then God will say, tell me, did that car ever hit the track? Did the rubber ever hit the road? And you'll say, well, you're God, you would know. Yeah, I know, but just tell me anyway. And you'll get to say, yes, that car hit the track, and I was a part of it. And we moved forward. We were able to reach out. And there was a point where we were certain that it was worth the risk. And we did love our neighbor. By all the things that we did for them together, we fulfilled the vision. Oh, and God, one more thing. We discovered that the promise was true. What promise was that, God says? That you were near. You were near the whole time. Step by step, side by side. It was true. And God will say, I was, and I am, and I always will be. Amen.